Hi everyone, Michael Britt here. Now, I'm very proud that the Psych Files podcast has been so successful. It passed the 20 million download mark. And a lot of that success is due to my episodes on how you can use proven memory strategies to remember just about anything, from memorizing terms for a test to remembering people's names at a party or a meeting. So I put all of these episodes into one audio course. Hippos, aliens, and llamas quickly master the tricks to a great memory. And it's available now on avid.fm/memorymaster. All one word. Michael Britt here, the host of the Psych Files. Understanding these biases may shed some light on some other issues of the day. In particular, on the issue of rape. I think if the idea of blaming the victim crops up, and it does to explain a variety of societal conditions like the poor, are the poor responsible for being poor? There are many other problems in society to which the blame the victim idea is applied, yet never more so than in the issue of rape. Are the victims of rape responsible for what happened to them? It's still talked about every semester on college campuses. There is an orientation, and during that orientation, this topic is typically brought up. And, in doing a little bit of background for this, I consulted one of the better-known texts in social psychology, and this one's by Aronson, Wilson, and Ackert, 5th edition by Prentice Hall. Let's start at the beginning. Where does this blame the victim come from? It is part of a number of what are called attributional biases, or causal attributions. If you don't want to introduce the word bias, you can simply see these as part of a larger set of causal attributions. We talked about these last week when we were talking about the work of Martin Seligman. Now, his work on what he calls explanatory style falls into this broader category of attribution theory, which is sometimes referred to as causal attributions, because they all deal with our tendency to try to figure out what caused things to happen. What is the reason? And if it is said, which it is, that we are all psychologists, this is because we are all involved in trying to figure out why something happened. Let's take a look at these attribution tendencies that we have when we try to figure out why something happened. Why did that happen to that person? Why did Bill say this? Why did Mary do that? Why did people do what they do? First and foremost, when we do this, when we ask ourselves, gee, why did that happen? We tend to make the fundamental attribution error. And that's actually what it's called, fundamental attribution error. What that error is this. Here's a quote from the social psych book. The fundamental attribution error occurs when we assume that people do what they do because of the kind of people that they are, not because of the situation they're in. So, our first mistake when we go about observing people in the mall or our friends, our coworkers, the first mistake we tend to make is that we overemphasize the personality of the person when we try to figure out why they did what they did. An easy example of this is if you are walking down the street and there's someone walking down the street across from you and that person trips and falls, our first instinct is to think that that person is clumsy. Right? We jokingly might say to ourselves, walk much. I mean, we assume that people are just, it's something the person fell because of they're just clumsy, I guess, right? We emphasize the person. Now, what does the person emphasize? Well, of course, they emphasize the situation. They look at the sidewalk, they see that there's a crack there, but you don't have that information available to you. What Aronson refers to as the fact that people have, quote-unquote, perceptual salience, which is just another way of saying that it's the person who stands out for you, not the situation. So that is why the first thing we think about when we try to explain why someone said something or did something, we think about their disposition, their personality. It's their attitude. It is the way that they are. We don't know what happened to that person earlier in the day. So we might say that someone said a mean thing because they're mean. We don't know that that person may have had a difficult experience earlier in the day. They had something go wrong. They were in a temporary bad place. We don't have that information. The only thing we have is that we're looking at the person. Now, this has obvious implications for the blame the victim phenomenon, but we'll get to that in a moment. A couple other biases I want to talk about. So, that's the fundamental attribution error. We focus on the person and attribute their actions to their personality. Next bias is called the actor-observer difference, or the actor-observer bias. While, as I mentioned, we tend to look at other people and attribute their actions to their personality, we attribute our own actions to the situation. So in order to explain what we do, when we look back at what we did that day, particularly if we did something that is a little out of the ordinary, we look at the situation. So again, it goes back to that falling down on the sidewalk thing. We can look at the situation. Unlike an observer who looks at us and sees the only thing moving, which is us, when we think back, we look at what? The situation. So this is an understandable way of thinking. Now think about where this occurs in daily life. A good example, I think, would be in any kind of trial. So if you're watching a criminal trial, what is it that the prosecution does? What is their focus? If you're trying to get someone to go to jail, then you have to focus on their personality. So the prosecution tries to convince the jury that the person did what they did, let's say that they murdered someone, because they are a bad person. They are mean. They are, I guess just saying they're a bad person really sums it up quite well. The defense, on the other hand, does what? They try to focus on the situation that the defendant was in. What this has become so common, it's almost become a little bit humorous, I suppose, in a way, but because what the defense will do is to focus on the person's what? Their childhood. It was a difficult childhood. They were abused as a child. They were under stress at the time. Something, and of course this is what also leads to a little bit of the blame the victim. You're either going to blame the person's childhood, or that they were abused, or that they were under stress, or you're going to say that something about the person that was killed drove the client to do what he or she did. So it is interesting to look at what occurs in the courtroom and who makes the better argument. Because the jury will probably make the sort of tendency that we all make, which is to think that if someone is accused of doing something, they did it because of their personality. And the defense will have the task of trying to attribute it to the situation. Okay. So those are the two first ones we're looking at, fundamental attribution error and then the actor-observer difference. Those are really the two to keep in mind. There is an exception to the one we just talked about. All of the above occurs except in a situation where we experience a failure. So we tend to take credit for our successes, but we blame our failures on external causes. Self-serving attribution. Now, this happens a lot in college. For example, the infamous expression, I earned an A, but my professor gave me a C. So we like to think positively of ourselves, and it threatens our self-esteem to think that failures were caused by something about ourselves. If you get a bad grade on something, are you going to say, well, I didn't study. I was irresponsible. I didn't try hard enough. All of those could be true, but that's difficult to take. And it takes a certain maturity to be able to sit there and say, I should have done better. And it is our first knee-jerk reaction to say, well, this was a hard test. That professor is impossible. It's difficult. Come on. So we blame our failures on external causes. Another place where this shows up a good deal is in professional sports, or even amateur sports. When a team wins, how do they attribute that win? They attribute it to their talent, their skill. They give themselves that internal attribution. When they lose, what do they think caused that? Well, obviously they lost because of poor playing conditions, or the bad calls from the umpire, or just bad luck. All of these external things. Because it's hard to say that you lost because you didn't train hard enough. Or, you know what, the team just wasn't as good as the competition. Hard to say. It feels bad to attribute our failure to ourselves. It takes a good deal of maturity. Okay, so to summarize these three. Fundamental attribution error, we focus on the person to explain their actions. Actor-observer bias, we look to the situation to explain our actions. And the self-serving bias, everything above is true except when we fail, and then we attribute failure to the situation and success to ourselves. Okay, those are three interesting ones, which we'll build on when we get to the question here of blaming the victim in rape situations. Two more things to talk about. Optimism bias. Okay, and this I think is very important for us to think about. This is the one, you probably are familiar with this one as well. We tend to think that bad things are less likely to happen to yourself. This is particularly true of teenagers, right, of young people. They don't think that bad things will happen to them. They don't think that the chances are that that would happen, and that is what's called a defensive attribution. So why are our teenage insurance rates so high? It's because, of course, they get into accidents. Why do they? Because they just don't think that an accident will happen to them, despite all of the education regarding that. I remember when I was a young man, I can't say I was the greatest driver. Young men are probably the most dangerous ones. An interesting example from the Aronson text is extreme sports. The people who engage in extreme sports really do have a strong sense of optimism bias. They don't think they're going to get hurt, which I guess you would have to have if you're going to jump, if you're going to do bungee jumping or other kinds of extreme sports. This happened quite a while back, but if you're my age, you might remember this when Jim Fixx died. He wrote a book. He was a runner, and he wrote a book called The Complete Book of Running. And that was a perplexing and upsetting death because we all thought that he was in good health. And it sort of turns your world upside down when something hits home like that. When someone your own age gets cancer or dies of a heart attack, it upsets that optimism bias, your belief that nothing bad is going to happen to me. It happens to other people, but it doesn't happen to me. So, why do we have the optimism bias? Because I think the world is a scary, unpredictable place. And that fact just makes us anxious. And the only way to feel a little better is to believe that you have control over your life. Maybe we believe we have more control than we really do. You hear about something happening to someone. And now we're getting closer to our main topic of the day, which is rape. It's upsetting to think that it could happen to you. So what can you do? Well, you can't do anything about the fact that there are bad men out there, that there are bad people. So you can't really do much about that. So what you can do, though, is you have control over your behavior. And so you would like to believe that you would have done something differently than that person. That wouldn't happen to me because I wouldn't have made the same decisions as that person. So you see where this blaming the victim starts to come in. We don't want to believe that the world is a chaotic place that doesn't really care about us. We want to believe that the world is just, that it's predictable. And that is another expression you might hear, that many people have a belief in a just world. They think that bad things happen to bad people. And believing that makes you feel a little bit better. Or, another quote here from the Aronson text, bad things happen to bad people, or at least to people who make mistakes or poor choices. Thus, bad things won't happen to me because I wouldn't make those mistakes. It keeps these anxiety-provoking thoughts at bay, as Aronson says. So, when the world is chaotic or dangerous, this is anxiety-provoking, and what we tend to do to reassure ourselves is to blame the victim. All right. So let's just go back then and talk more directly about the question of the day. There is an interesting article. I have a link to it on my site, and it is by a woman named Camille Paglia, Paglia. It's interesting because within this quote I'm going to give you in a second, she even mentions blaming the victim. She's talking about date rape on college campuses. So, quote, college men are at their hormonal peak. They have just left their mothers and are questing for their male identity. In groups, they're dangerous. A woman going to a fraternity party is walking into testosterone flats, full of prickly cacti and blazing guns. If she goes, she should be armed with resolute alertness. She should arrive with girlfriends and leave with them. A girl who lets herself get dead drunk at a fraternity party is a fool. A girl who goes upstairs alone with a brother at a fraternity party is an idiot. Feminists call this blaming the victim, but I call it common sense. Unquote. So, she thinks that young women should have common sense. Now, I agree that women should be equipped with as much knowledge about the realities of life and about teenage men as possible. It certainly is true that teenage men tend to have the one thing on their mind, and women need to be educated about, to really understand the male mind. And that's really sort of our argument here, right? If we think that women should know what they're getting themselves into, then if they get into that situation anyway, then we have a tendency to blame them. Now, I agree that women should be equipped with as much knowledge as the realities of life as possible, but here's the point I'd like to make. If we think that knowledge is all that's needed, I think we're wrong. Let's go back to teenagers and driving. Decades and decades of driver education have not put an end to teen driving deaths. Why not? Because knowledge alone will not overcome the optimistic bias. We do not think these things will happen to us, no matter how much knowledge we are equipped with. So let me just conclude then. It's natural, I believe, for all of us when we hear about a terrible event that has befallen someone to wonder whether or not that person should be able to avoid it, should have been able to avoid it. That's the fundamental attribution error. It is a natural knee-jerk reaction. These kinds of difficult events make us feel anxious, and this is our way of trying to deal with the anxiety. But if we take a moment and think about this tendency to blame the victim, we will realize that it's unrealistic to think that someone should have known. Last week we talked about Ellis, and he talked a bit about shoulds. This idea that people should have known is, certainly Ellis would call that unrealistic, and I would say irrelevant. What should people know? Should people know things? Yeah, I suppose so, but I'll go back to, even if they did, the optimistic bias is stronger. It really doesn't matter what people should or should not know. The optimistic bias is more powerful than what you know. So, in the end, what can you do to prevent tragedy? You should do all that you can do. But remember that as hard as it is to realize, as anxious as it may make you feel, the truth is that life is filled with chaotic, unpredictable events. So, what can you do? I don't know. Look around. Be grateful for what you have. A good life. One last thing. Remember to check out my memory course. You can use these strategies to get better grades on your tests, to remember people's names, and even help you to remember those jokes you keep forgetting. So you will be amazed. avid.fm/memorymaster. That's avid, AVID.fm/memorymaster. Thanks.